Okay, so one of the other cases I wanted to talk about has to do with the Chevron doctrine. And it's pretty interesting because when you teach courses in law, it's rare that you encounter such a massive shift in law during teaching. So just recently, this June, the Supreme Court made a decision on a 40-year-old Chevron doctrine that has been the leading law in administrative law, guiding courts and agencies for the past 40 years. So let me give you a little bit of history on this so you know where it comes from, and then talk about what's recently transpired. And I'll explain why this is such a big shift and such an important deal. And it got some press, but most people don't really understand the magnitude of what has transpired here. So EPA and Chevron are basically on the same side here, believe it or not, in this case. But basically, there's this issue where the stationary sources of air quality are at question. Okay. And there was a definition under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. And it basically was talking about uh, what a stationary source is. And stationary sources, as we talked about with air pollution, other things, that's a source of pollution, right? Um, and under this, the court determined that basically you don't need to know the sort of details on all of this, but the court, it was struggling because it's like, you know, stationary source wasn't specifically defined for this portion of the Clean Air Act that was under question in the court case. And they were using this sort of bubble concept where they were drawing a big bubble around the operations of a large power plant or say a refinery, like something Chevron would run, right? And they said, well, we can use this bubble concept and say, look, there's a lot of different machinery and things going on that are all part of one large mechanism, if you will, that are all trying to accomplish one large job. And so they said, we're going to put that bubble concept over this one large facility, if you will, and say that it's not just every little, piece of this that's providing pollution. It's the entire facility that we're going to regulate for pollution. And the environmental group said, no, we want you to regulate each little, piece individually. And both the EPA and Chevron said, no, that's not reasonable. And in fact, we have this definition of stationary source, albeit in a different part of the Clean Air Act, and we're just going to apply it here. And the agency said, look, we're the experts on this. We're the ones that are administering the Clean Air Act as the EPA. And we think that we have the authority to, make this interpretation. And ultimately, the Supreme Court sees the case and says, agencies are, in fact, experts in their subject area. That's why they're agencies. That's why they're administering things like the complicated Clean Air Act. And you should only really second guess them if you can demonstrate a significant failure on their part. Like they've really screwed up somehow in implementing the laws and regulations that they are charged with. A difference of opinion or interpretation, that's not a reason to say that they've messed up. It has to be demonstrated that their decision was unreasonable or not in accordance with the law itself. So this is when I talked earlier about a recipe. This is where it comes down to, the interpretation of a law. So you look to the Chevron doctrine, and we, for many years, referred to this as the Chevron two-step. Look to the law itself. And so you look to the law itself and you say, is the intent clear? Right? Is the law clear? And you'll see, and when you review the Constitution, everything else, sometimes the law just isn't that clear, right? We write things with only a handful of sentences. I mentioned, the Endangered Species Act. It's only 27 pages long, and it's, a pretty short 27 pages, really. And yet there's a lot of stuff that comes out of that 27 pages that guides the United States. And so is the intent clear? Well, maybe it's not, right? And if it's not clear, then there's something you have to do about that. But if it is clear and the agency hasn't followed it, then the court doesn't defer to the agency, right? If the law is very clear and it's obvious that the agency is not following the law, the agency has made a mistake, right? But if it is clear, and the agency did follow it, then the court defers to the agency decision. So that's the first question. Is the intent clear? Yes or no, right? But if the statute is silent or ambiguous on the issue, right, that's the second part, right? Is the law kind of fuzzy? If it is, then the court asks, is the agency's interpretation based on a permissible construction of the statute? And if so, it generally would defer to the agency and say, yeah, that interpretation is reasonable. Now, it didn't have to be the only interpretation or the quote, right interpretation, just a reasonable one. And so people suing the agency would come forward and say, well, this is the better interpretation of that law or regulation. And the court would say, well, yeah, you think it's the better interpretation, but the agency thinks this is the right interpretation. So we're going to give them deference, right? And so this was known as Chevron deference as well. So if you make it all the way through a court case and you're focused on and using Chevron as the standard for review, this case now set the standard for all sort of administrative decisions nationwide, and it became a huge, huge piece of administrative law in the United States. The courts had basically a couple of options in a Chevron case. When this standard was applied. The first was to hold unlawful and set aside, right? The agency action was found not to meet the standard of review, right? The agency screwed up. So therefore, what their decision, their interpretation of the law or the regulation is set aside, and they're going to have to do something different. The court prefers, however, to rest the rejection of an agency on procedural grounds, and that would happen a lot of times, right? And a lot of cases got decided based on procedural things, like you had to provide 60 days of public comment per the regulation, and the agency had only given 59 days, and the court would say, well, your new regulation that you provided is now off the books because you didn't follow your own regulations. You have to provide 60 days. You didn't do that. So this was a weird time in U.S. history because courts were giving federal agencies a lot of deference, saying that you guys are truly the experts, and you'd have to have done something really egregious in order for us to say that you haven't implemented a law or regulation properly. The other option to the court was to remand the case, right? So the court would say, well, we're not going to make a decision on the case, but we're going to kick it back to a lower court to make a new decision. And it gives the agency an opportunity to cure the issue, right? And it gives another opportunity to assemble a record and say, no, we're gonna put together a proper record, and have all the data and information we need to show the court, the higher courts, that we definitely have our stuff together, and this is definitely the way to go, right? But again, courts did not wish to substitute their judgment for that of these so-called agency experts. That was sort of the feeling for this time period. And truly, from sort of this Reagan era 1980s, court decision in the Supreme Court, this is how we treated things for 4 decades. The idea too was that, hey, judges aren't experts, right? And judges kind of felt that way, is that we're getting more complex court cases, mostly based off of things like environmental law. And you can think about this in terms of wildfires and stuff too, right? The complication of things like combustion and urban interface issues and materials and engineering and design and operations and maintenance and fuel reduction programs and all of that. I mean, try and have a judge who's basically been interpreting, different laws and statutes for years, and ask them to be, an engineer, a physicist, a chemist, a, biologist, and try and interpret all this stuff. A lot of judges become uncomfortable with that. And so not surprisingly, they would want to defer to agencies saying, hey, look, they've made a career out of this. They are in these positions of authority. And so we're going to give them that ability to make these decisions, and we're going to assume that because they're in these positions, they do have the expertise, and we're going to allow them to hold fast to those decisions, unless again, there's a really good reason why they shouldn't, right? Um, but really, if judges aren't the experts, don't forget these agencies are really managed from the top down. The chief executive, the president of the United States, that administration sets the policy for each one of these agencies. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because these agencies aren't always just independent agencies. They're operating, and we used to talk about this a lot, especially with groups like the Forest Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Your mandate is set every 4 to 8 years, depending on who the president is. And, that administration kind of sets the tone and the direction of what your agency is doing. And so, therefore, leaving something up to an agency, recognizing that the chief executive is sort of helping create the mandates and the direction, it again sort of additionally sort of complicated things by saying that judges are now giving deference not just to agencies necessarily, but to the chief executive as well. Well, just last month, this all changed, and really just a couple of weeks ago. And it was based on two cases. It was Relentless versus Department of Commerce and Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. These are two sets of commercial fishing companies asking the Supreme Court to weigh in on their issue. Now, it's surprising because basically what's happened in the last couple of weeks is that Chevron and 40 years of history and interpretation in the United States has been overturned. Having worked in environmental law, and worked on Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, a number of things, not just in the wildfires sector, but across a lot of different fields. I'm kind of torn on this because I both disagree and agree at the same time. And so it's going to take me, personally, a while to sort of figure out, how I feel about all of this. First of all, these two cases, just to give you a little bit of background on this, National Marines Fisheries Service was the lead agency on this. This was the agency being challenged. The agency has required for many years that the herring industry pay for the costs estimated at about $710 a day to have an independent observer on board their vessel to collect data about the catches that they have and monitor for overfishing. While the program was in effect, the agency was able to reimburse fishermen for the cost of the observers, but not always. And especially by 2023, funding ran out, and the agencies definitely weren't able to, reimburse these fishermen. And so they felt like it was a bit of a government overreach. They were self-reporting. This had been going on for years, and when they come into the docks, you can see whether or not they've, what they've harvested, and they're saying, hey, look, this is a bit much, and this is a significant burden to us, disproportionately burdening us to carry monitors, paying for all of this. And we're barely profitable in the first place. And this ruling wasn't really based on science, wasn't really based on much of anything. And they felt like this rule was arbitrary and capricious. And so they challenged this in court. It makes it all the way to the Supreme Court very quickly. I want to explain again and emphasize why Chevron decision was such a big deal. When the Supreme Court first issues Chevron more than 40 years ago, the decision wasn't really a particularly consequential one. Nobody was really paying attention to it that much. It was a big deal for the Clean Air Act and the way we interpret air pollution in the United States, but nobody really thought it had legs much outside air pollution. But the interpretation of this spread widely, and in the years since, it became, it's actually the most cited law in the United States when it comes to administrative law, and other types of law as well, cited by federal courts more than 18,000 times since. And so this is, and when I was in law school, it was one of the things that was hammered into us in multiple classes, and was such a fundamental part of how the courts, especially federal courts, operated in the United States. This is why this is such a big deal. So, June this year, they cut back sharply the decision, led by Chief Justice John Roberts, rejecting the doctrine wholly, calling it fundamentally misguided. It cuts back on the power of federal agencies to interpret the laws that they administer. And they ruled that the courts should rely on their own interpretation of ambiguous laws. Kagan and others dissented, and they predicted that the Friday, it was June 28th, I believe, ruling will cause a massive shock to the legal system. So what does the ruling actually say? Now Chevron is inconsistent with the Administrative Procedures Act. That was really the underlying theme, right? So we started this lecture, talking about the Administrative Procedures Act. Chevron is inconsistent with that because under the APA, Chief Justice Roberts notes that the APA directs the court and that justice to decide legal questions by applying their own judgment. That's the underlying thing of the Administrative Procedures Act. That is the law guiding courts and agencies. Therefore, it makes it clear that an agency interpretation of statutes, like agency interpretation of the Constitution, are definitely not entitled to deference, right? It is up to that justice, up to that judge to make that decision. They are, in essence, the overriding expert. And again, so this gets into sort of a bit of a weird space because, are they really the experts? Under the APA, Robert concludes that it thus remains the responsibility of the court to decide whether the law means what the agency says it means. Roberts rejected any suggestion that agencies rather than courts are better suited to determine what ambiguities in federal law might actually mean. And even when those ambiguities involve technical or scientific questions that fall within an agency's area of expertise, remember again, these are experts in their field. That's why they're there. Roberts still emphasized that Congress expects courts to handle technical statutory questions. And they have since they were established by the Constitution of the United States. Courts also have the benefit of briefings from parties and what we call friends of the court. So other folks can join in on a court case, become friends of the court, and provide their own technical expertise as well. And so really what it comes down to is, are the judges in these cases and under these administrative type rulings able to take in all of the information from experts, not just the agencies, but all of the other experts and say, is this a reasonable decision that's being made by the agency? Or are these other experts, and they can bring in some other folks too. And I've seen this, and this is where I kind of struggle with all of this is, sometimes the agencies have some really good people working for them. Sometimes there are really good quality experts working at universities and research institutes and folks with years and years of experience who actually had worked at agencies and had, worked in the public and the private sector and have all of this variety of expertise. Who arguably are more qualified than those agency experts in some cases, providing their own, expert opinion about this. So how do you weigh all of that? And the old way of weighing it was to say, well, we're sorry, your opinion doesn't matter. We're just going to default and, let the agency's opinion matter the most. And unless it was, clearly arbitrary, capricious, and against the intent of the law, and all of those sort of standards, then hey, we're we're just going to go with what the agency says. And this is kind of where I struggle because I had seen that happen, in the past, and a lot of folks have, and so it's this it's a struggle because it's obviously a lot of this has undertones of conservative justices versus more liberal justices and all of that goes on in the Supreme Court today. But fundamentally, I think it's an important issue that we've struggled with for nearly half a century in the United States. So one of the other things Chief Justice Roberts observed is that even if courts should not defer to an agency's interpretation of an ambiguous statute that it has to administer, it can consider that interpretation when it falls within the agency's purview, a doctrine known as Skidmore deference. Okay, we didn't talk much about this, but basically what Skidmore deference says is, yeah, Congress and others, they're sometimes really bad at writing laws, right? And it's ambiguous, it's not clear. They're not experts in the sciences in a lot of cases, and so they write stuff that they don't really understand well, and they hope that the agencies create the rules and regulations and things behind that law to help interpret it and put it into its proper place, right? And you can see this from, air quality to water quality, climate issues, whatever the case may be. Um, and so there actually is a thing called Skidmore deference that has existed for a very long time. And so courts can still use deference and still have the justification to say, we're still going to, defer to the agency because we think their interpretation is the best. So they didn't do away with it entirely, and it still is an option for the court to use. It's just no longer the only option, that the courts have, and the bar set so high. There's this other term, it's called stare decisis. It's a principle that you learn in law school. Most folks don't know about this, but it's one that you can impress your friends with. Stare decisis is the principle that the courts should generally adhere to past cases, right? And so a decision that was made in the past by, it doesn't have to be the same judge, right? It could be other judges sitting in that bench, but they generally give them deference, you know, and they don't like overturning past cases. Well, we've seen that that's not necessarily the case anymore. And Stare decisis does not provide a reason to uphold the Chevron doctrine. And that was kind of a big leap for the Supreme Court, right? But we've seen that happen on a number of their decisions recently. And there's a lot of schools of thought on stare decisis, is that sometimes decisions were made for different reasons at a different time in our history, and our technological history, our political history, our civilization as a whole. And so relying on court decisions, based on something that was going on 40 years ago may not necessarily apply today. So we shouldn't be locked in just because of that. And if times do change, and if we need to be more adaptable, then courts shouldn't be handcuffed by past decisions. And so we're seeing that playing out not just in the Supreme Court, but in a lot of federal and state courts as well now. So it's a very interesting time in the legal world. One of the things, though, I'd mention is that the outstanding question still remains on whether cases decided under Chevron should be overturned. Now, nobody's going to roll back the clock 40 years and go back to those cases, but more recent cases, and it should be noted that in the last 8 years, not a lot of cases were decided under Chevron. So there's not a lot of folks sitting back in the last 8 years or so that are saying, oh, going to overturn my case, and I'm going to fight for this thing because of a bad decision that we think was made. Now that Chevron's overturned, I'm going to go back to court and fight this thing. You know, there's a weird thing that happens, when the law is changed, that sometimes the courts will provide for the opportunity to challenge those past decisions. Sometimes they won't, and there's no sort of running statute of limitations on challenging. They haven't quite made that decision yet. But the easiest thing to do really is, there may be a wide range of belated challenges to recent court decisions that have some undertones or relationship to Chevron, and they can bring those cases forward again if they choose, if there's still a case in controversy. Remember, you still have to have standing. It can't be moot or ripe. It has to be ripe. All of those standards still have to apply. And they can be tried again. And with Chevron, basically gone at this point, if the case is tried again, maybe it turns out differently. And if it does, some folks may be trying to bring other cases forward to see if those decisions and things would change. Okay, so this week, this is a lot of information for you all. It's a big, busy week for the start of the semester, I realize, and a lot of basic foundational information, from Constitution to administrative law to stuff that, folks in a regular law program, each one of these topics would take you a whole semester to learn. I'm trying to give it to you in, one day. So I apologize for that. There's going to be a discussion for you to all join in on the group forum related to the Constitution that I'd like you to join in on. And then there's going to be a quiz that's posted, and this is all going to be due Sunday before midnight. The quiz is going to be on Chevron. Do a little online searching on this stuff, read some of the information that's out there on the court case, and kind of get your own interpretation of where you think it is. But originally, I'll say Chevron created a pretty high bar for overturning an agency's action or decision. Bar wasn't impossible to overcome, but it was really hard. In court, agencies can serve as experts, but so now can other key witnesses and subject matter experts that provide testimony on behalf of plaintiffs. So the questions are pretty simple. Are agencies always the best experts? Does politics play a role in how agencies conduct themselves? And does that really, the bottom line is, does that really influence, agencies' decision making and expertise? And then, can judges really serve as experts on topics, especially those based on complex issues, so with statistical or scientific subjects? If so, how do they become, experts on those topics? And if not, why not? And that's kind of what I want you to ponder on, and look forward to working with you all for the next 5 weeks. It's going to move fairly quickly. Things will be posted on Monday of every week, and assignments and everything else will be due by that Sunday. There will be just one final exam at the end of the semester that is due. I will be providing you some information on that pretty early on, so you can all prepare for it. And as always, I'm available by phone or email if you have any questions. And thank you so much for joining me this summer. Take care.